Sometimes a motorcycle comes to define an entire movement within the motorcycling community. Think bikes like the Hayabusa or Honda Grom or Yamaha R6, the Triumph TR6 for desert racing, the Suzuki Gixxer for track day warriors, the Electroglide for American touring, or the BMW GS for non-American touring. For the iconic ton-up boys of Great Britain in the 1950s and 1960s, that motorcycle was the BSA Gold Star. In many ways, I think of the big British singles of the 50s and 60s as sort of supersports for their day, not necessarily the absolute fastest motorcycles that you could get for the road, technically speaking, but almost the fastest. And unless under the control of an expert rider, the difference between the bigger, faster bikes like the Bonneville or BSA Lightning were almost negligible in the 1960s. Many of these singles were the fastest of their day in the 40s and 50s though. A Yamaha R6 today is really all anybody could ever need for performance. Most riders would not be any faster on an R1 or a big 1000cc Gixxer or Ducati. But the BSA Gold Star was so much more than just another big British thumper, and in this video I'm going to show you exactly why this motorcycle became an icon, first by taking you back to its origins. By the late 1930s, when the first Gold Star would come into existence, BSA was not just the largest British motorcycle manufacturer, they were the largest motorcycle manufacturer in the world, period, and by a lot. But they weren't really known for designing sporty machines, not in the same way that other British marques like Triumph and Norton and Velocette were. BSA's first foray into road racing in 1921 was a complete disaster and a significant loss of resources for the company. But in many ways, this actually saved BSA during hard times like the Depression and then World War II. BSA had focused so much on making in-house reliable motorbikes for riders in the real world, alongside making necessary products in other industries. Making guns and motorcycles wasn't a bad gig when wartime rolled around. But that lack of success in racing made it so that they didn't focus so much on just making sporty machines and spending all their money in racing, much like other British companies. And this made it so that they were a more, useful and practical company, and the war didn't kill their company like so many other British companies. But everything changed for BSA on June 30th, 1937, when a 500cc single-cylinder motorcycle from BSA would power around the famous Brooklyn circuit at an average speed of over 100 miles per hour. And this would be the birth of arguably the most famous motorcycle that BSA would ever produce. Now, the Brooklands race is really its own story worthy of its own video. I'm not sure how many of you have ever ridden a motorcycle from the 60s or 50s, but I know from my experience riding my old Triumph that really any speed that anyone would consider even remotely fast for any prolonged period of time on these old machines, well, it's mildly terrifying. So a motorcycle averaging over 100 miles per hour in 1937 with just a 500cc single cylinder, this is the stuff of legends. Now, this racetrack was not just like a big circle. This was a difficult 2.7 mile track. It was 100 feet wide at all points, and it included two 30-foot tall banks. This racetrack was one of the most complex, advanced tracks for any motorsport racing in its day. Brooklands had this tradition. Basically, if you could average over 100 miles per hour in any class on any lap, you were awarded a Gold Star. So BSA, coming virtually out of nowhere with this new Empire Star model, under the control of famed rider Walter Handley, they were able to average 107.57 miles per hour on a single lap. And the Empire Star would soon become the Gold Star, named after that prestigious award. This is essentially what would become known as the pre-war Gold Star. And this motorcycle, it's really not as much the subject of this video, but that early model was really the foundation of what would come, and it's a legend in its own right. They're incredibly rare and incredibly collectible. But in the same way that later Gold Stars would become symbols of rebellion, this motorcycle's birth as a production motorcycle coming out of that Brooklands event was really one of rebellion as well. The company at that time was not fans of road racing, so its development would come about in secret from within the company, much like the 1994 Mustang. And this rebel group from within BSA took the Empire Star platform and they made it into even more of a racy, high compression ratio motorcycle with 13-to-1 compression when utilizing alcohol fuel. It had a racing magneto and a supposed 34 brake horsepower, but most believe it made quite a bit more horsepower than just that, because it ultimately powered by the competition with ease against bikes that were producing significantly more than 34 horsepower. Now, this early race bike really led to the first production Gold Star, which was the M24. Not quite the crazy race machine, but still fast for a production 500, producing a guaranteed 28 horsepower and capable of over 90 miles per hour. In 1940, the Gold Star models were dropped so that the company could focus on more utilitarian machines, no thanks to the war. But during that pre-war period, the Gold Star platform had proven itself somewhat in road racing, but more primarily in endurance and reliability trials. The Gold Star had a rare ability to not only go fast, but go fast for a very long time. And I really believe that this was the key to the Gold Star becoming the motorcycle of choice for so many riders later on, wanting a bike that was fast for the road. The Gold Star wasn't the fastest motorcycle in the world for most of its life, but it was close and it could hang with anyone in the right rider's hands. But it was a bike that felt good at fast speeds for long periods of time. More on that subject later, but I really do think that before the war, this is what really laid the foundation for this bike to be such a hit. No Gold Stars were produced from the BSA factory through and after the war until 1949. This second generation Gold Star, the ZB32, a motorcycle for the public specifically designed for racing. It came in essentially off-road trim, but it was designed to be versatile. One could easily switch it over to a road and road race-worthy bike as well. Now, this was a 350cc single with varying compression ratios depending on what pistons were utilized, and it was capable of 25 horsepower at 6,000 RPM. Fair numbers, even by today's standard, for a production 350 single. In the history of British motorcycles and racing, no other platform has ever been as versatile as the Gold Star. A Gold Star could easily win the local road race on Saturday, and with a few subtle, simple modifications, go and dominate off-road racing on Sunday. The ZB34 would come next, which was a 500cc single capable of 34 horsepower at 6,400 RPM in the early 1950s, and this was achieved due to extensive updates every year. They were always making the Gold Star better and faster. Now, perhaps this bike's most important place of success was in the newly formed club racing or clubman TTs. This was an affordable way to experience competitive road racing. Standard production models were the only bikes allowed to be used of certain specs and with only certain modifications, one being the now iconic clubman-style handlebars. The first Gold Star win came in 1949 under H. Clark on his 350cc B32, averaging 5 miles per hour faster than the previous year's winner. Overnight, this became the bike to have for the 350cc clubman class, and in 1950, 44 of the 350cc bikes were BSA Gold Stars. And really, these early TTs were dominated by B32s. The B34 500cc bike would have its day in 1954, and then multiple years going forward, there would be double wins for BSA, at one point even won by the same rider in both classes. And by the end of the Clubman TT in 1956, many people blamed BSA and blamed the Gold Star for basically killing the original spirit. Basically, if you weren't on a Gold Star, you weren't competitive in the Clubman TTs at the Isle of Man. In simple terms, no company was producing a more race-ready motorcycle for production than BSA. Sure, there were many great, fast, reliable production bikes. My Triumph 500 was a fantastic platform, going all the way back to its inception, basically the same year as the BSA in the late 30s. But the Clubman TT would be the real proving ground and ultimately help to create the legend of the BSA Goldie. This was hands down the raciest motorcycle available to the public in the 1950s. Now, as much as the Gold Star is remembered for its success in road racing, if you lived through the 50s and you cared about motorcycle racing, you knew that it was so much more than just a road racer. Now, scrambling has its roots in British motorcycling sport dating all the way back to the turn of the century, but more officially, the 1920s. In simple terms, this is basically just off-road racing, but it also included time trials and endurance racing. And in America, a little bit later on, we see a lot of desert racing. The trickiest part of scrambling, as opposed to using current modern motocross machines, is that these machines lacked so many of the proper things needed, like proper suspension and proper brakes. This meant that the sport itself could really only be competitive for the best of riders, and you really needed the right production bike to be able to do this. And the BSA Gold Star came with most of the right stuff needed to work off-road. Detailing all of the Goldies' success off-road and trial success really isn't necessary. The thing to know is the thing we already know at this point. This big single was incredibly durable and incredibly useful in any form of racing. And though the ton-up boys that we're going to talk about soon rarely took off their leathers and headed off-road, they did know how to beat up their machines. And no other motorcycle could have its headlight removed easier for road racing or scrambling than a BSA Gold Star. It was just like basically 4 tubes held to the frame and you could just easily remove it in minutes. Then came the Thruxton 9-hour, or the 500-miler as it would later be called, essentially an endurance and reliability road test for production motorcycles. Whoever could get in the most laps in 9 hours won. It was pretty grueling. And the first event, held in 1955, was won by Eddie Dow on a 500cc Gold Star. The next year would be completely dominated by Goldies. All of the top 6 places were Gold Stars, 4 of which were 500s and 2 of which were 350s. Later years would prove well for other companies, especially for the twins going forward from 1960, but by then the Gold Star had already made its mark. And this bike would really take on its iconic design starting in about 1953 with the BB32 and BB34, and at this point the Clubman style Gold Star was available for purchase from production, and this would really be the motorcycle of the ton-up boys and cafe racers' dreams. Now, cafe racer culture dates all the way back to before the 70s in America. I know a lot of people think of it as a 70s thing here. And even before the 50s and 60s in Great Britain, after the Depression, riders were happy to be back on the road, and there was an influx of income and new accessible highways, and that meant that they wanted to go fast. Now, after the Depression, these early sort of cafe racers were nicknamed the Promenade Percies, and this was less of a fashion statement happening. It was really just about going fast and experiencing performance-oriented bikes in a new way on faster roads. These riders would throw off anything unnecessary in hopes of gaining more speed, including things like mudguards and mufflers. But in many ways, it's the race-ready production bikes like the BSA Gold Star that sort of brought back this culture in the 50s and 60s. By the early 50s, rock and roll was taking hold on Western culture, and the image of the motorcyclist as a rebel really wasn't too far off. In Great Britain, the desire to ride the fastest and sort of closest resembling bike to the race machines of things like the Isle of Man, well, that was what people wanted. The proper sort of countryside rider in tweed was really disappearing, replaced by leather-clad rockers making lots of noise and going as fast as possible. And then add to that the allure of race-ready bikes like the BSA Gold Star produced in limited numbers. It was the ultimate machine to have. It was sexy, it was fast, and it was reliable, if not a bit difficult. But hey, that's never stopped sporty riders. Sure, it didn't idle when set up properly with the bigger AML GP carb, or as they say across the pond, it didn't tick over. But that was because the carb wasn't set up to get enough petrol into the engine. The ton-up boys, or cafe, coffee, bar, cowboys, there's a lot of different names for them. Well, they were a bunch of rowdy but honestly harmless youth who did silly things like tried to ride up and down a particular road before a song was over. Many thought that there was drug use that was rampant, but there's really no evidence of that. The ton-up boys and cafe racers, they were harmless. Usually they were just drinking a cup of coffee and then riding off like a bunch of goofballs. And like most movements, whether it's goth or emo or being a ton-up boy, it was really more of a harmless styling exercise than anything else. You know, the leather jacket, the leather flying boots, the goggles, helmets were somewhat optional, but the ultimate combination of style and performance for these guys was the BSA Gold Star, especially that final Clubman Gold Star, the DB34 500. Few motorcycles at this time gave off the overall vibe of a Gold Star, the sound, the look, the feel. Much like Ducati's sport bikes of today and of the last 20 years, the Gold Star really stood out in every way from the competition. It had that unique sound due to the specially designed exhaust. It gave it a sound unlike any other British bike of its time. Again, much like the mechanical sound of Ducati's dry clutches, when you create a performance-oriented icon, having anything unique, especially a certain sound attached to that, is just brilliant. When I decided that I wanted an old British bike, it was pretty simple for me which one to get because, it was the one that I found the most appealing and most interesting, and that is the old Triumphs. And in many ways, those motorcycles have something that no other motorcycle will ever have. And personally, I've actually never been a huge fan of BSAs from that era, just in terms of looks. They just never quite looked as good as the Triumphs, but I will say, the Gold Star is different. It's the one BSA to me that really stands out the same way that the Triumphs do of the 60s. It is utterly timeless. You can tell, no matter how far removed we are from it, that it is a purpose-built machine. It looks old, but it also does look fast. Even just the unique way the exhaust header comes down from the engine, much like the Velocette Thruxton. But again, the Velocette singles, they don't have that sleek sort of clubman look that the Gold Star has. I think the proof of this bike's influence is shown in the 60s. It was still well into the 60s, the bike of choice for riders all over the world, even though BSA had essentially stopped updating it and the twins were outperforming it, and these other bikes could be operated with so much more ease. That final Gold Star produced no more horsepower than my Triumph 500. In fact, many said that the 500 twin was actually faster than the Gold Star. But again, like the Ducatis of the 90s and 2000s, sometimes you sacrifice owning a motorcycle that's a bit more difficult and maybe isn't the absolute fastest machine on the planet because you've got the coolest thing on the road. Sadly, these motorcycles are either forced to update or die. Maybe the Gold Star could have lived past 1963 if BSA thought about changing it and essentially domesticating it and making it easier to use for the ever-changing rider, but in many ways that would have been the death of the Gold Star as well. Sometimes you just gotta let legends live as legends. Now, as many of you know, BSA has been revived as a motorcycle company recently, and the flagship motorcycle for this company is of course going to be called the Gold Star. And it will be a big single basically, with decent specs, but it's still basically going to be a slow retro bike. No doubt the new company has seen the incredible success of bikes like the Royal Enfield Interceptor, taking an old iconic name, but more than anything, making a great classically styled modern motorcycle. It can work, and it can be done well, and it can be done affordably. And in many ways, Royal Enfield is teaching all the companies a lesson that you can make a cool retro bike and it doesn't have to be $9,000 or $10,000 or $12,000. We have the Bonneville, the revived Kawasaki W Series, the Interceptor. These are all old, great, iconic motorcycles that have been sort of hijacked and repurposed, often to sell nostalgia, but the original sort of spirit of those bikes is pretty much gone. As much as marketers and designers may try, those who actually know, those who rode Gold Stars in the 50s and 60s, or maybe ride them today, they know that whatever this new Gold Star is trying to be, it's no Gold Star.